Welcome to round 3 of our Lives in Law and Policy speaker series, which is being co-sponsored by Northeastern's Humanities Center, and Lori is back there. Thank you, Lori, for participating and co-sponsoring. So we heard from Michael Goldman. We heard a lot from Michael Goldman last time. Those of us who are he's actually still talking, right? So see, now you know he really was here. So we heard from Michael Goldman last time, and he talked about sort of differences when he grew up in the '60s and now, and he had worked a lot in politics, and your career has been more in policy and law. So I guess what I would like to do is sort of begin by having you talk a little bit about your background, where you went to school, when you went to law school, and the other theme of this series that Governor Dukakis has also reflected on is advice and offering thoughts on options after undergrad, whether to go to law school, why to go to law school, and what opportunities are out there for someone who wants to work in law and public policy. So there's a lot there, but
Fine.
we'll
Hi
start.
everyone, I'm Joanne Goldstein, and I ended up with a career that I never thought I would have, which was pretty interesting. So I'm from Massachusetts. I went for my undergraduate degree to the University of Michigan and majored in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies, and then didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I sort of took the LSAT exam on a whim, partially because it was in the late 60s, early 70s, and it was a very political time, very charged atmosphere, and it sort of felt like that was a pathway to do good. So I was planning to go to the University of Michigan Law School, and then got married very young, still married to the same guy, 45 years.
You're wondering how the story ended
Yes.
up. Right.
Yeah,
Right.
45 years. And he got a job in New York, and so we moved very abruptly to New York. And I couldn't decide then, should I go to law school? I mean, at the time, these decisions felt momentous, and when I look back, it was, any of the choices would have been fine. So I ended up, the only school I could apply to that late in the cycle was a brand new law school at Hofstra University. And I applied, and they gave me a fair amount of money, so I said, you know what, I'll go. The tuition, just FYI, was $2,000 a year. And I went to Hofstra, and I was the second graduating class.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out to be a great place to be because it was very free and loose. It was new, and I spent my last semester in law school working for legal services for the whole semester, which you couldn't, I don't think you can even do now.
And maybe you can explain what legal services
Oh, legal
does.
services was a federally funded local law office that provided legal services to people at the poverty level or below in civil matters.
So if they're getting evicted.
Right, divorce, unemployment, business issues, bankruptcy, all those kinds of things. So I had decided I wanted to go into labor law and represent unions, and we were then moving back to Boston, which is where we were both from. And I got an interview at the then leading union side labor law firm in Boston, and there were no women doing labor law in Boston at that time. Probably few in New York, but none in Boston. And so I applied, and I got the job. And the way I found out I had the job was I had submitted my expenses to be reimbursed, because as young, starving students, we had very little money, so I needed the money quicker than I knew if I was going to get the job. So as soon as I got home, of course, I submitted the tickets to get reimbursed, and I got a check in the mail signed by the then senior partner. Now, you probably don't even know about these things because they don't do checks anymore, but there used to be a memo line on a check. Do you all know that? I'd like to tell you what it was for.
Happy birthday, we love you.
Yeah, and it said, "Girl to be hired."
Wow, they didn't know. It was almost like they didn't know you'd be reading it.
Right, so here I was.
Or if they did, what kind of place is this to work at? Either way.
Right, so here I was becoming a labor lawyer, on a union side firm that's supposed to be for, justice and workers and everything else. And the first woman, obviously, and the way that I knew I had the job and I was identified was as a girl. So I started there, and I was there for about 8 years, and it was a very mixed experience, I have to say. The work I did was fabulous. I loved representing unions and employees. There was a colleague of mine there, and we had come at the same time. But just to show you the discrimination then, they made me start the day after I graduated. So I literally graduated on a Sunday and was at work Monday morning. When he came, they let him start after he took the bar exam, which was
August.
Yeah. And they gave me a week off to study for the bar, which was ridiculous. But at the time, he just was so grateful for the opportunity and experience that there wasn't much I was going to do about it. So I worked there for 8 years, represented a lot of new unions in the healthcare field, because it was just recently that they got to organize.
So, like
nurses, technicians,
right.
And after about a year and a half, some employees came to us, and they were the support staff at one of the big law firms in Boston. I don't know how many of you know different law firms. This one is called Foley Hoag.
Has anyone here been?
There's a co-op with them.
Right,
oh, really?
co-op. Yeah,
Okay.
so usually they have a couple of Northeastern students co-oping at a time, but don't. I'm sure they don't work there anymore. Whatever you're going to talk about.
No, it's fine. It was in the newspaper, so it doesn't
Okay.
matter.
Okay.
So 3 people who worked at Foley Hoag decided they were going to form a union. And at the time, law firm employees were exempt from the law that said you could organize into unions. So we filed a petition at the National Labor Relations Board on behalf of the United File Clerks, Messengers, and Librarian of Foley Hoag and Elliott, which was 3 people, and went to the board and asked for an election, and the law firm tried to get it dismissed and couldn't. So the case went all the way to Washington, and in a rare case, the National Labor Relations Board, of which there are 5 members, asked for oral argument. And the firm that I was with didn't really care about this because it wasn't important to them, so they let me, fly to Washington and do the oral argument. So here I was out of law school for a year and a half. I remember hyperventilating all the way to Washington, like, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? And I'm proud to say we won, and it was actually in the New York Times, which my father went out and bought, of course, 50 copies. There was nothing online then. And just to show you the difference in the time, I don't mean the New York Times, but the Times, they would not identify women at that time as Ms. It had to be either Miss or Mrs. You had to tell them your marital status, as if it mattered, even though men, of course, were just Mr. So I stayed there for about 8 years, and when I was having my second child, I decided I wanted to be on my own, so I started my own law firm, continued to represent unions, primarily utility workers, at Boston, well, now it's called Eversource and National Grid, and did that for quite a long time. The gentleman who was the president of the local became the president of the National Utility Workers Union. And when he became the national president, he took me along with him to Washington to become general counsel to the National Union. And I did that for about 10 years, commuting back and forth. And then he retired. He was considerably older and retired. And I was trying to figure out what to do. And I got a phone call from the chief assistant of then newly elected Attorney General Martha Coakley, who asked me if I'd come work for her as the chief of the Fair Labor Division, which is the part of the Attorney General's office that enforces wage and hour laws on behalf of workers of the Commonwealth and makes sure the businesses do what they're supposed to and protects legitimate businesses against businesses that don't play by the rules.
Anyone here applied to or done AG?
I applied. Haven't heard from them. It was last week.
And I said no. I could not envision myself as a state employee. I had had very little contact with the state because most labor law is federal, and so I had really had very little interaction with the state, and I had been in Washington for the past 10 years mostly. And I had not done any wage and hour cases, so I'm thinking I'm going to be chief of a division when I'd never even done one of those cases. And I said no. And I also said, I don't want this rigid time frame of having to be there every day from 9 to 5. I have 3 kids, and I want the opportunity to go to their basketball games or whatever. And the person who called me, David Freedman, kept saying, it's not like you think it is. You can take off to go to a basketball game because we know you're going to work really hard and work nights and weekends anyway. And
are you thinking, no?
Right. And you'll have a staff who will help you with what you don't know. We're not hiring you for your technical knowledge. We're hiring you for your management skills and your ability to deal with people. And so I finally said yes. I figured, what's the worst that'll happen is if I don't like it, I'll leave.
And if I could ask, what got you on that radar? I mean, you were prominent. Because I think
point.
These things don't happen by accident. It's
right.
good. This is also just good advice. Networking and building your brand.
No, that's
right?
really a good point. My philosophy is you never burn down a bridge because you never know when you're going to have to walk over it again. And you always treat people not only the way you want, but you treat them the same on the way up, because someday you're going to be on the way down, and it's going to be the same people there. So you make sure that you do right by everyone you come in contact with. So the way they got to me, which is sort of interesting, is not through my legal career or my any knowledge. I mean, they knew what I did, but I had a friend who was in healthcare who had worked with this man in healthcare, and he was saying how we're looking for someone to fill a bunch of management jobs at the AG's office, one of which is in labor. And she said, I have a friend who's in labor who's probably about to leave her current position. You should call her. So it was totally sort of serendipity that we connected, because I wasn't thinking of even, as I said, going to the state, and they wouldn't have known I was looking for a job, except that this mutual friend connected us. So I went to work for Attorney General Coakley for 3 years. It was an incredible experience. I loved working for her. She was a wonderful boss. I thought she was a terrific Attorney General. And I stayed there for 3 years. And then I got a call from the governor's office asking if I was interested in becoming the Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development. And just to show you again, this is sort of a funny story. I remember I was in the parking lot at Whole Foods, and I got the call from his chief of staff. And they hadn't yet announced that the prior secretary was leaving. Her name was Suzanne Bump, and she was leaving to run for state auditor, but it hadn't been publicized yet. So when I got the phone call, I thought it was a trick call. And I sort of brushed the guy off and said, can I call you back in the morning, and give me your office number, not your cell phone number. And of course it was legitimate, so probably silly, but it all worked out. And so I then met with the chief of staff, and then I met with the governor, and he appointed me as the Secretary of Labor and Workforce Development, which was one of the 8 cabinet positions in any governor's administration. And I did that for 4 years, for the second term, basically. And that was the best job I've had, but also the worst job I've had. It was the most intense, overwhelming, 24/7 job that you can possibly imagine, going 100 miles an hour.
And most of it was managing, right?
Most of it is very little. I did very little law. It was managing, putting out brush fires, managing crises, managing people, dealing with the press, which is not fun, and doing all those kinds of things. And so at the end of the term, I knew obviously that well, first of all, I didn't want to stay any longer anyway, because 4 years was enough in that job, but I also knew that if Governor Baker won, I was not going to be reappointed, since we were from different political parties. So I started looking for another job, and all of the networking I had done really paid off, and all of my philosophy of being kind to people and making sure that I wasn't slighting anyone really paid off, because many, many doors opened for me. And even when people didn't have jobs, they were very willing to talk to me, to help me. And I ended up here at Northeastern, as you may or may not know, working in the College of Professional Studies, doing a variety of things, helping find students from employers, working with Foundation Year, which is the program for Boston Public School students to get to college, working with the co-op program, doing some of the political work of the college, etc. So that's sort of my career trajectory. And when I remember sitting in an auditorium taking the LSAT, and I could never have envisioned what I ended up doing. I mean, it didn't even occur to me that I would be anything more than a routine lawyer. I just sort of assumed that what you start at the beginning of your career is where you end up, which is really not true. And part of it, I think, was that I was really open to trying new things, which is somewhat scary, I have to say, when I look at some of my colleagues and friends who I started doing labor law with in the mid-'70s, and they're still doing it. And they're perfectly happy, but I think a little bored, frankly, because they've been doing the same thing for 40 years and haven't expanded much in terms of what they know, what they do, who they know, how they work professionally, etc. So I think it's just really important that when you start your careers, which will be soon, hopefully, that you won't assume that the first job has to be your best job, because frankly, hopefully it's not going to be your best job, because if you peak at your first job out of college, you've got a really long life ahead of you. Right. So, hopefully it's not your best job, but it's really, I think, really helpful, as much as it's hard to believe, that, you're going to have fits and starts, and you're going to have high points and low points, and you're going to have bosses you love and bosses you hate, but they're still the boss. And you just keep moving forward, and you will likely end up where you want to be.
That's great. I guess the other thing maybe that you could offer some thoughts on is the decision to go to law school. How many people here are at least considering? Right, so we're more than half. Right. So it sounds like when you made the decision, although you did not reveal the full tuition after the 3 years,
It went up to $2,600.
Right. Well, but I think you know where I'm going,
Right,
which
right.
is that now, we're looking at, closer to $200,000 for debt after 3 years, and the legal market has really changed. So I guess, when Governor Dukakis was here, he said, look, there are a lot of good master's programs, or go work, have the employer pay for it. So I guess part of it is the landscape for those thinking about going to law school. And the advice that I usually offer is, if you do want a job like labor lawyer that requires a law degree, then by all means, but not to go to law school just for the sake of continuing your education and hoping it'll lead to something. I'm just curious about your thoughts.
I guess I'm a little more mixed than that. I think if you definitely know you want to be an active lawyer, clearly law school is the only choice to do that. If you're not sure, I certainly think working for a year out of college makes sense before you plunge into that high debt and 3 more years of a grind. But I also do think that law school can give you the foundation to do lots of things that aren't a strictly legal job. I think you learn how to think a certain way. Hopefully you learn how to write well, if you don't already know that. So I think law school can give you the foundation to do things other than be a traditional lawyer. I think there are other pathways too. I mean, master's degrees, business school. I think there are other pathways, but I do think it's still a viable pathway to careers other than being a traditional lawyer.
Right, and then I guess the one other thing would be, since you've been in a lot of management positions, were there things that new employees, those who are fresh out of college, things that they did well that you noticed, and then were there things where people made mistakes that maybe we could offer as preventative medicine here?
Right. I think that as new employees, obviously you have to work hard, you have to be at the top of your game, you have to present yourself well. I would say the biggest negative that I saw with young people in first jobs or even second jobs is their lack of patience about what they were doing and where they were gonna go. It felt unlike, and I know this makes me sound very old, but unlike when I felt I was younger, even thereafter, we sort of all knew we had to pay our dues, that our first jobs were not gonna be our best jobs, we were gonna do lots of really crappy things in our first jobs, potentially have bosses that were really awful and didn't treat us well and, didn't cross a line, but weren't exactly fun to work for. And what I notice among many young people now is their impatience at getting further along than they are in not wanting to pay dues. And that's a big mistake. I interviewed a young woman when I was still a secretary, and I was asked to interview her, so of course I did. She was at Mount Holyoke, which is obviously a good school, was about to graduate, and she came in, and I said, so what would you like to do when you grow up? Oh, I didn't say it like that. And she said, I'd like to go into policy. And I said, that's great. I said, what job were you looking to apply for? And she said, yours. And I thought,
Doesn't sound like she said it in a funny way either,
No,
right?
she was
Because
not.
maybe she did it with a smile.
no,
right?
she was quite serious. And I thought, this does not bode well for your future. I'm not particularly worried you're going to take my job, but I am worried for you because I worked very hard to get where I was. It wasn't just handed to me, and it didn't happen in 2 years or 5 years. And I'd say the biggest thing is to have patience and recognize that not every work experience is going to be peak, and not every part of every work experience is going to be magical. And the other thing that I think is really important is to network. I mean, keep a Rolodex in your head, on your computer, in your wherever, that you can go back to. And the third thing is to be polite and kind. When you send thank you notes to people, they remember, especially if they're higher up on the food chain than you are. When you treat people well, they remember. I always say that it's easy for those of us who have been blessed in life to find some of the working people we deal with invisible, or not as smart as us, which they may not be, or not as together or as high in their careers. Don't ever underestimate how much someone can be a resource or a help to you, regardless of their position. Because the secretary to the boss has a lot more access than you're going to as the brand new kid on the block. And when you're nice to that person, she will make sure that you get what you need. If you're not nice to that person, forget it.
And that's also, it's also a good job interview piece of advice, which is they're paying attention to how you act, right? The sort of joke is, if this is you on your best behavior and you're not being very nice during a job interview, imagine when you're not behaving as well.
Right.
And then the other point, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, the co-op is such a great opportunity to explore different careers. And even, who's done co-op already? Okay, was it perfect? But it was still a great learning experience. So you learn from it, and I would say the co-op is even another chance to expose yourself to
Well, I think the
different
value
careers.
of co-op is not only do you learn how to work, but you can decide if where you're at is the kind of career you want to end up being in. It really is a sort of a no-risk, gives me opportunity to try out a field. So I definitely am a co-op fan.
Great. I'm happy to open up. This can really be, completely free-flowing. So I will open it up to any questions, observations, comments you might. And please, if this will help you, if you could introduce yourself, talk about your major, and maybe where you're from.
Okay. I'm LJ Sanchez. I'm a management major, and I have a minor in law and public policy. And then I'm from Walk Hill, New York. It's a small town upstate. I was wondering, because you brought up how you had colleagues or friends from law school that entered in the same field and stayed in the same spot for the rest of their career, and they're maybe bored by this point or just didn't move, whatever they decided to do. Do you think that going into your position as a woman and how they viewed you at your first law firm or labor union law firm, do you think the way they viewed you helped you move on and create your own law firm, or were you going from the beginning, no matter what, going to say, I'm going to champion my own path and do what I want to do?
No, I did not do that. It's a really interesting point. I would say that some of the experiences I had propelled me to sort of change course. So I had assumed that I would stay with that law firm forever. I mean, I didn't have the vision. I had young kids. It was sort of comfortable, even though it had its issues. And after my first child was born, I asked to work part-time. And they grudgingly let me work 3 days a week, and but then gave me a lot of aggravation about how much I was billing, even though, believe me, I was billing plenty. And then when I got pregnant with my second child, I said, this really isn't for me, because I don't want to live with this pressure all the time. And I decided to try it on my own. Now, one of the big clients of this firm, who I had represented at that point for 8 years, was willing to come with me. Had he not been willing to come with me and bring his union, I might not have been so brave. But I knew
You had a soft landing.
Right,
You
I
had
knew
good
I would
stability.
have.
Yeah.
And I started my law firm in my bedroom with a portable typewriter, you can imagine. Sounds so quaint now, but. So I do think in many ways circumstance propelled me. And then when the president of the National Union retired, I did not want to work for the new president. I didn't like him as much. He lived in Detroit. I mean, it just didn't work for me. Had the former president been younger or had stayed in that position for longer, I probably wouldn't have left either, because it was comfortable, I knew it. So I do think in some way circumstance propelled me into changing pathways. I like to think that I would have done it eventually anyway, but I'm not sure I would have.
Good question.
Yeah, that is a good question.
I know you said you were doing different
Julia,
things.
you gotta introduce
Oh,
yourself.
sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Jumping right in.
No, you're ready for the question.
I'm Julia Bouchard. I'm a third year here, political science major, also minoring in law and public policy, and I'm from Westwood, Massachusetts.
Oh, nice.
So my question, I know you were doing different things, but I guess what were kind of the pros and cons of working in a big law firm versus your own versus a state position?
So they all have pros and cons. I would say a big law firm, you make a lot more money. You
Your resources to draw upon.
You
right?
have a lot of
Right.
resources.
Human
Yeah,
and material.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, you don't have to think about, did I order the paper for the printer, cartridge, I mean, there's people
Seriously?
who worry about all those things for you. I never was interested in working in a big law firm for a couple of reasons. One is the pressure is enormous to produce, to bill in 6-minute increments, which I was never the least bit interested in.
This is worth just bringing up, because I think for some people who have not worked at a law firm or heard of this, this is actually really important. So, if you don't mind for this little
Go,
detour, historically, law firms, it was a profession, law firms would send a bill that said, for legal services rendered,
Right.
and you paid the bill. Well, as the market got more competitive and then clients said, legal services rendered, I'm not just going to write you a check, I want you to account for these legal services. The pushback meant that law firms started to create what's called the billable hour. The billable hour could be divided into 10 6-minute increments, so that the way you got paid at a law firm was to bill for your time, which could include point 1, which is
Right.
6 minutes. There were some people that said, I always thought about the client, in the shower and during my commute, which then allowed me to take a quick lunch break. But in terms of the incentives that it creates for your behavior at work, it's gonna be a little bit strange, because you always sort of have to be talking about the client or working on it, right? And there's pressure where they set maybe not mandatory, but at least advisory goals for how many hours you should bill per year.
Right.
And some people, has anyone worked in a law firm? Did they have the billable?
No, I don't know. I'm like in shock. It's very
Okay, but
Yeah, I worked in a small law firm and they had the same.
they billed their time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's mainly the big sort of fancy firms that do that. So I wasn't interested in working under that system, and also for me, which is obviously an individual choice politically, I wasn't interested in doing the kind of work that most of the big law firms do. I wasn't interested in helping corporations get richer and, you know.
Evade liability. For
Yeah, so
doing bad
it
things.
just wasn't for me. In fact, when I was in law school, I signed up for an interview at one of the big firms. I thought, I'll try one interview just to see. And after I was interviewed by the second or third person, I said, this isn't for me. What am I doing this for? It's like a waste of my time, waste of their time. So I thanked them and I said, I think I'm just going to leave. It's just silly for us to continue. That made me so desirable. It was hilarious. They said, no, you can't leave. People don't walk out of here. I said, well, sorry, I'm doing it. And they kept pursuing me to come back, and I thought, boy, that's the way to make yourself really desirable, to say I'm not interested,
Well,
right?
the takeaway, I was going to connect this, though, it may not have been on purpose, but
No, it
when
wasn't
you
on
told
purpose.
when you told Dave Freedman
Right.
that you were not interested, so here's
Right.
this interesting piece of advice, right? Play hard to get, but in employment matters, but with Dave Freedman, it meant though that you didn't need the job maybe more than they needed you.
Right.
So it sends a message that you have other options and you're confident enough in your own abilities that you could say no, given the conditions.
But it's also tricky, because you have to be careful if you really want that job and you say no, that they say okay.
You have to be that good.
Right, well,
Maybe.
but also comfortable with, with you're saying no leading to it not
Right.
working out.
And I
Right.
really meant in both cases, I thought I meant no in the AG's case. In the firm, I definitely meant no. So, a big firm has lots of advantages. It was not a career choice that I wanted to make, but it definitely has lots of advantages, and it has some disadvantages. Working in a smaller firm or working for yourself, I think, has a lot of advantages in the sense of flexibility. You can pick more of the work you do, you can pick your schedule better, but there's a lot more pressure to bring in clients and money, because you're counting on yourself to support yourself.
And the printer paper.
And the printer paper. And, working for the state has lots of advantages. I was obviously in a very high-level position, so I did have a lot of resources for myself. But even sort of at the staff lawyer level, the pay at this point is decent. The work, if you're in an interesting agency, can be really productive. There's no pressure in terms of the billable hours or any of that. You do have to put up with some nonsense in terms of bureaucracies. And some of it depends on what your lifestyle choices are. If you're a primary parent or you're a primary caregiver for your parents, it's very nice to know that you can generally work 9 to 5 and not have the pressure of nights and weekends, or if that's just your lifestyle choice. So I think they all have advantages and disadvantages. I also think you don't have to decide immediately whether you and end up in just one of those choices. I guess I'd say if you want to go to a big firm, you probably have to do that right from law school and be very successful in law school, but small firms, self-employment, state employment, federal employment, you can really do that later in your career.
And I was going to say, the legal field, it has its, I guess you could say, snobbery and hierarchy, where they
Right.
like the big firms like to hire people from fancy schools and with good grades.
Right.
But the other opportunities can sometimes be
Right.
easier.
But I have to say, I know plenty of people, including myself, who didn't go to a fancy law school and didn't go to a big firm and ended up with really terrific careers. And this is hard to imagine, but at some point, no one asks you anymore where you went to college or law school. I mean, it's just...
Well, and people that are talking about it all the time later in life, you're like, wow, haven't you done anything?
Right.
It's been 30 or 40 years, right?
It just doesn't, other than telling you tonight, which obviously had a purpose.
I asked, right?
The last time I would say anyone asked me or was interested in where I went to law school was years and years ago. I don't even remember. Because there's a point at which what you've done for work supersedes where you went to school.
Well, and then everyone can relate to this. It's that moment on the resume where experience is at the top and
Right,
education's at the
right.
bottom. Right now, because you're at a fancy school and you're in school, education's at the top.
Right. Right, no, that's true.
It's kind of
Right,
when
that's true.
that formatting changes,
Right.
right? Yes, please. And introduce me.
Hi, I'm Haley Havens. I'm a sophomore here, and I'm bio, and then law and public policy minor, and I'm from Madison, Wisconsin. And I guess I was just sort of asking, I see that your career spans some decades that have seen a lot of change from like globalization, technology, civil rights. How would you say you've seen the industry change, either from your day-to-day work or just overarching?
And especially, do you also mean especially labor? Because that's a great question because you're from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
No, it's Scott Walker. No,
Right,
so
right.
do you mean law, or do you also mean labor unions, or both?
Anything.
Perfect, because I know that there's so much to go
Right.
with there.
So on a sort of work level, I would say clearly the world has just totally changed. As I jokingly said, but it was true when I started my career. I mean, we used typewriters and mimeograph machines. You probably don't know what that is.
By the way, you say, like, if I give a paper back and I say, be careful to edit your typos, I don't mean typo, because typo is typographical error where the wrong key was hit, right? I'm just saying on an electronic document, just so you know where the word comes from.
Right.
The word comes from the wrong key hitting the page, right? Just like a funny
Right.
concept.
But everyone had landlines and voicemail and everything. And now obviously it's all technology. And I think that's hard for many people of my age and generation. I find it difficult myself, but because of the positions I've had, I've always been in the fortunate position of having assistants who know all that stuff because they're young and can do a PowerPoint for me or do an Excel spreadsheet for me or do whatever needs to be done on a technology basis. But for people of my generation who don't have that luxury, it is very hard. And when I was at the state and one of the agencies I supervised was unemployment, and it was really hard to see people 50 and over who lost their jobs and could not figure out how to get another job because they just did not have the technology skills to keep current with what was going on now. And even people in high tech who, weren't necessarily the brains behind the outfit and were in the same position even for 20 to 30 years, so they were clearly strong employees, but their capacity to learn new IT, sometimes they could do it, and sometimes frankly employers wouldn't give them the option of doing it. They felt they were too old and they wanted someone very young. So I do think technology, as important as it is and as helpful as it is, has really impacted older workers in a way that means we don't get to take advantage of the depth of their experience and all that they could bring to jobs and employers because most employers aren't willing to give them an opportunity if they're not already there. So in that sense, I think it's both good and bad. In terms of the union movement, I do think they in many ways missed the boat on technology. To give you an example that I'm personally familiar with, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, which represents the employees at the telephone company, which was then New England Telephone, when it decided to start their cell phone business, the union said this will never last, so we're not going to go after the employees who are in that division.
To be union members.
To be union members.
Oh, wow.
So they clearly missed out on the entire cell phone industry, which meant that when you look at telephone services, for example, they probably have 20% of the market, and the other 80% is non-union because they didn't keep up with the understanding of technology that it would go the way it went. And most of the new industries like Apple and Google and Nike and all those kind of places, and certainly the smaller startups, they're all non-union too, in part because I'm not, as much as I am a strong supporter of unions and the union movement, I don't think they always do their best at organizing and figuring out how to keep current. So some of it is their own fault, but some of it I think is that they underestimated, as many other people did, that technology was really going to change the economic landscape of the country and the globe. And so they missed that.
And I was going to say, courts, and especially the Supreme Court, hasn't helped
Right.
in that they've been
Right.
pretty much systematically
Right.
limiting
Right.
the power of unions over
Right.
the past 30
Right.
years.
But, I mean, although I agree with you, the Supreme Court has certainly not helped, and some of the administrations haven't helped. If the unions had a stronger presence in more important, in not in more important, in newer industries, who knows how that would have helped them to withstand the Supreme Court rulings.
And, right, and the court rulings tend to reflect dominant cultural
Right,
trends, right? So,
right.
great.
Such a quiet crowd.
Can you tell us what you're doing at Northeastern?
Sure. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the College of Professional Studies. It's the college for working adults. It's partially online, partially on site, some hybrid courses. And it's mainly, there's a small undergraduate component, but it's mainly graduate programs. And all of the graduate degrees are career focused. So, for example, we have a master's degree in Homeland Security. We have one in regulatory affairs.
Project management.
Project management. If you want to go find yourself in your master's degree program, CPS is not the place to go. We don't have any courses.
Right. Art history,
Yeah,
right,
no.
literature.
They're all sort of very career focused and dedicated to that. There's also a small undergraduate program.
But the focus is increasingly on STEM, right?
Yeah, so the undergraduate program, which we've just sort of launched, is to give community college graduates the opportunity to get a bachelor's degree in STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. And again, it's geared to working adults. I'd say our average age is probably 30, maybe a little bit older. There's 9,000 students registered in CPS, not all of whom are there full-time at any one time. So what I'm doing is really tapping into my skills that I brought to the job. So one thing I'm doing is, instead of trying to have students come one by one like you all did, because it's a harder proposition in CPS than it is in an undergraduate program like you're in. So I'm working with employers to have them send groups of employees to CPS. So for example,
Like
if there's...
partnerships.
Yeah, to develop a partnership. So let's say there's a big construction company and they want to train their middle managers in project management. So I'm working with those companies to send a cohort of their employees to CPS to maybe do some professional development, so it's not all degree focused.
And CPS can be flexible in the delivery and
Yes,
timing,
we're very
right?
flexible.
Yeah.
The other thing that's really interesting, just as an aside, in terms of your careers, I was stunned when I got there to see how many employers no longer care if you get master's degrees. They want you to have the skills and they want you to have the experience and the expertise, but they're not as committed to master's degrees as the workforce once was. EMC, which is a big employer, as you know, they have their own sort of training institute for employees in the technical fields and the soft skill fields. We do it like, management, how to do all those things Northeastern does, but in the technical part, they do it themselves. They are teaching in 7-minute modules. And they put it on, I don't even know what the platform is called.
But I think it's, what is it? It's an intranet. I think it's.
But you could, like, the training director told me a lot of their employees, especially the younger ones, take the training on their iPhones while they're commuting into work, because it's all 7-minute modules. And they don't care if you ever get a degree, because a degree is not relevant to them. They care that you know the product and you know the technology and you know whatever it is you need to know.
And this brings up such an interesting, larger question about what is college for? Are we training citizens? Are we nourishing the soul? Or are we training workers? No, really, I'm serious. It brings up, and I think these are competing impulses.
Right.
And also depending on where you are in life. Because everyone here who's, what we would call you, residential full-time,
Right.
day full-time, is getting what I think is a wonderful opportunity, which is that you're in school full-time, you're hopefully attending some of your classes, learning from them, but also from one another and everything else, right? But then think about it, down the road, and maybe you have a family, and you're busy, you still want the skills, but you don't have time to pick up and move somewhere for 2 years.
Right.
So that's
Right.
part of the,
Right.
they're tapping into that.
Well, and we're
need.
also very focused on underserved populations. So we do, so one thing I'm doing is the corporate partnership work. Another thing I'm doing is trying to figure out how to do co-ops in CPS, because it's most of our students are already working somewhere. They can't just leave their jobs to go to a 6-month traditional co-op.
It's tricky.
But
Yeah.
being at Northeastern, we want to give them a co-op experience. So we've come up with various ways of doing it, some online, some doing what's called co-op at work, which is you do a special project at your existing employer, not for full-time 6 months, but something particular that you wouldn't do in your regular job. So I'm involved in that. I also supervise Foundation Year, which I think I mentioned. It's 80
Great program.
Boston public school students who sort of a one cut below the ones who got into, fancy schools with full scholarships. So Northeastern has this amazing program
That's
where we
great.
take 80 students, and it's a very holistic approach, since most of them don't have resources, don't have family support, don't even know how to go to college, or don't even know how to study.
Almost always first generation to go to
Right.
college, but also through, just because I've done a little work
Right.
with them too, through the admissions process, learning that it's a student who has potential but may not be ready for college
Right.
at that point.
Or
So-
doesn't have the resources to go.
Right, and it's funded.
Right, so it's a holistic approach. It's funded, they get a laptop or a iPad. The staff is very interactive with the students. Someone doesn't show up for class, they get a phone call.
Yeah, it's 5 days a week.
Yeah, they
all
have to
day.
be here 5 days a week, 9 to 5. Because in addition to classes, they get tutoring and mentoring and lunch and things that they need. And then at the end of the year, Northeastern Day, which you all are, takes about 10 to 15% of them on a full scholarship. And some of them have been incredibly successful. One got a full grant, I think, last year or the year before.
Anna Rangel Fellowship, and he's now going to become a foreign service officer.
Oh, yeah, right, I did
He was
know that.
yeah, he happened to be my poli-sci student.
And the others who don't have sufficient grades to get into Northeastern, Foundation Year places them, but helps them find placement, I should say, in either a community college or a state university or some other appropriate place.
And something just hit. He guest lectured to
Yeah.
Michael. Sorry. So this is where we're talking about Stan,
Right?
and I just remembered that many students in this room met Stan
Oh, okay.
because Stan came and talked about his human rights work
Oh.
as a foreign service
Okay.
officer. So
Okay.
just to bring the word. 'Cause I saw the buzz. I saw people in the class who were like, "Wait a minute, is there another person with that exact background?" Right. So maybe there is. Right. So.
You had another question?
I was just going to observe that, you've composed a life that you've described here that seems quite meandering. On the other hand, you said you started not exactly knowing it would be law school or what for, but that you had a certain intention of doing a kind of good work in the world. And it seems, listening to that, the trajectory, which now looks like a long one, you sort of got exactly where you intended to go. I'm wondering, I asked about Northeastern because I wondered how much of your legal work, legal experience, interest in the law was relevant. In some ways, not at all and completely.
Right, right.
So that, I feel like for our students, there's a wonderful takeaway that here's somebody who's smart, well-intentioned, who gave the same exact advice as Michael Dukakis, who came in and said, just be nice to everybody. That is the consistent piece of advice that they're getting, and cultivate your skills, and in the end, you can choose to do the kind of work you want to do in the
Right.
world, and it will.
Well, and what I also feel that I've been very blessed because it was important to me and has stayed important to me to do work that I believed in and was meaningful to me. I mean, not everyone cares about that, and that's fine, but for me, it was a really important variable that my work matched my beliefs. And I feel very blessed that I was able to keep that throughout my career and do work that was meaningful and did continue to match my beliefs,
Great.
so.
Other questions, comments, observations?
Feel free.
Pizza. Now, we can formally wrap up. You are permitted at this point to take pizza that we have, which is part of the lecture series and everything else. But there might be some people that are on the shy side that might want to just come up and
Absolutely.
chat. So,
Happy to do that.
but please join me in thanking Joanne.